Hello everyone, I'm Rajesh Isangupta and we are at the week 12 of our course Indian Art, Materials, Techniques and Artistic Practices. So this week is the concluding week for our course, and this week we'll be talking about the multimedia approaches, which is a continuation of our discussion from the last week. So in the last week we have spoken about some of the developments from the in 1940s during the time of India's independence, and continued until 1990s or 2000s around that time, and have seen that certain kind of practices, how there were many back and forth in terms of how the question about material, the question about the imagery, all those things have emerged in artistic practices. At the same time, how establishment of certain kind of institutions, for example, MSU Baroda or NID in Ahmedabad, and then later the other centers, all of them have contributed largely to the making of the contemporary art and design in the Indian subcontinent, as especially in the independent nation state of India. Now this week we'll be talking about the multimedia approaches, and I will be focusing more from 1990s until today, that there are certain things that we need to keep in mind, that what are the key developments during this time period. So from the 1990s we find with the new liberalization, with the this new growth in economy, when India was so called like opening up to the world for the different companies to sort of have more newer kind of collaboration with the Indian market, at the same time with the workforce, then we find that there were increased use of technology in many sectors. So for example, we see rapid industrialization in terms of the textile sector. Then we also see that how machinery making, development of software and everything, they have also emerged with the new liberal this approach in Indian economy. So with that we also find that there was a tremendous growth of the urban economy. So if you remember in the last 2 weeks when we spoke about the in the early 20th century, the nationalist approach, like when we see the people who were in favor of the British rule to decline, then we find starting with Gandhiji and other people, and then even during the first few decades of India's independence, we find that there was a considerable stress on the development of the rural sectors in India. Now I cannot say that the rural sectors are ignored after 1990s, but what we see, there was a disproportionate rise in terms of how the urban centers came into prominence. So the metropolitan cities and then some of the other urban centers who specifically were well known for industry or education, so they came into the scene. And this growth of the urban centers, that we also find that how people from various rural background, they can be from the artisanal sectors, they can be from different group of people who were arriving in the urban center for education, for work and everything else. They have also shaped the socio-political situation during this time, and that also started reflecting on the art market. Now with that we also see that there was increased movement in terms of that how many Indian artists, designers, they started traveling abroad. So something that we have discussed in the earlier week as well, that how people like Ritan Majumdar, people like Nelly Setna and the other artists like Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh and all, they have traveled abroad and they have interacted with the different sectors of art and design making all across the world or several parts, and then they brought those knowledge back to India. and that is how we see that there were different kind of conversations which were happening between artistic practices. So that is something we see this time as well, but we also find that West, like especially Europe and North America, were more and more opening up, like in terms of the galleries, the museums, they were more and more opening up to recognize the contemporary, the Indian artist and the designers from this time. So before that, we definitely have some of the path-breaking exhibitions. Some of the landmark exhibitions will include like textiles and ornamental arts of India in 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and several other exhibitions. But from this time, we find that the critique, the curator, the art historians, they have also stressed on the contemporary art making in India, and not just the things which are from the history or some of the stuff which have the artisanal background. So this is something we find that it was certainly a new kind of development in terms of Indian art, and also how the market relation, the relationship between the artist, curator, educators, designers, art historians. So that sort of started changing, and a more dynamic conversation started shaping up from this process. Now, with that, we also see that slowly there was discussion about new media, and by new media strictly, which is understood at least from the late 1990s and early 2000s, that the media which were traditionally not incorporated in the artistic practices. And by artistic practice, I mean that the artistic practices which started from the mid 19th century in the colonial art institutions. So the traditional paintings, sculpture, printmaking, installation, so those things were there, but at the same time then we find that in the idea of new media came to represent a group of technologies which were previously not incorporated in the artistic practices. So as I have already mentioned that in the 1990s, this decade marks a huge importance in terms of how technology is incorporated in our daily lives. So there is no surprise that technology also became an integral part of art making. So during this time, we find that there are more experiments with audio, with video, and then certain so for example, that if there are moving images, if there are audio files, how they are also been made as part of the so-called display in the white cubes or in the gallery spaces and the museum spaces. So this is something that definitely requires attention from all of us to understand it differently from the earlier art making. However, I would also like to be critical of this word new media. So when there is this term new, we always need to question this idea that new compared to what? New compared to when? So these are some of the questions we need to ask. And if we see that how technology, which was already in use in this in the Indian society, that was absorbed or that was incorporated in the artistic practice, this tendency we should not find it to be a new approach, because even previously, whenever we have for example, if we think about like the rock cut architecture, so the technology of carving the rock and looking at the wooden structure, so that had also reflected on the contemporary art making or making the architecture. So we should not think that this newly emerging technologies and their reflection in the art is something that is new. So strictly speaking, that when we speak about new media, we mean like this technological interventions into art making, but we always have to be careful about how we make how we use this kind of terms. Now, talking about new media, what are the kind of representations we talk about? So I'll start this discussion from this one particular work by artist Nalini Malani, and that was not displayed in 1990s but from 2013, and from there we'll slowly go back in time and come back again. So In this work, as you can see that it's a drastic departure from the works on canvas, the works, the sculptural works and so on. So, in this one what we see that there are some of those fiberglass cylindrical shapes, those are hanging from the ceiling. So, instead of having them on the gallery wall, the walls are always been very important in terms of the gallery display, as we can see for viewership. But here it seems like more than the walls, we find that this hanging projection from the ceiling, they get its importance, and that is something that we can think about it, that how the shift from the wall to the ceiling, something that is not displayed vertically on the wall but vertically from the ceiling, that is a different approach in terms of how the artists think about the space. Then we see in this fiberglass cylinders, there are hand drawn images, and then there are light projected onto them, and that is how the images are reflected on the walls. Now what happens in terms of when there are those multiple cylinders which are in action, and then there are motor attached to them, so that they constantly revolve. They do not stay in the same place, but they revolve like those the prayer wheels in the Buddhist monasteries. So when we see that is happening, then we see constantly the images which are projected onto the wall, they keep changing. And for that, and since this is a transparent surface, this cylindrical shapes, so for that reason one image gets overlapped with the other. And for the light projection, even if there is a change in the directionality of the light, then one image can superimpose with the other. So all those things, so what we see that on the wall, the kind of images they emerge from this projection, at the same time using of this very material for which makes this kind of overlapping superimposition possible, is something certainly was not used before. So this kind of interventions we find there in the artworks. And when we go into the into the thematics of this work, so we find that Nalini Malani, the way she describes her childhood memories of moving from the city of Karachi to Bombay, and then how there are those questions about identity in the newly independent nation state of India in the 1940s, 1950s, and then slowly her exploration about this identity politics, her position in the society. So this superimpositions, and then this identity which is always in flux, which is not something that is constant. So those things got reflected into the way these images are also constructed and they transform. So this kind of motion and movement is something that is not just there as part of the technological exploration, but it is very much part of it's very much part of the concept that the artist put forward for the viewers to see through it or to appreciate it. In this work, we also find that images like this one here, as we can see, that this is an image of a Britisher killing a tiger from the back of an elephant. This is a well-known Kalighat image that is there now in the collection of the Victoria Albert Museum. So some of those historical images, they also make their appearance in this highly complex works. And if we think about the medium where it is painted now, so if the earlier image was painted on the paper, and then this is now painted onto this transparent surface, which is then projected onto the wall. So altogether the history is brought back to the contemporary times, but at the same time the context is changed. So there is a back and forth between that. So this also comes to address some of the complexities during our times, that how much we are keeping the parts of the history with us, and how much that is transforming with each and every transformations or changes in our society. So those kind of questions we find they are were put forward when this advancement took place in the Indian society, and how those technologies were embraced and critically assessed by the artist for creating this dialogue with people, with history, with culture, and of course addressing the issues of identity. So with that, we also find that during 1990s, that there was also, as I have already mentioned, that a large number of people, they started moving from the rural sectors to the urban centers, and that also prompted a move of the artisans, so-called the folk artisans, the ones who are situated in the villages. So they in a large number, we find that they have started moving to the cities. So something we can think about that, how in the 19th century the Kalighat patuas were also functioning, but this time we find that this kind of activity was happening all across India, and some places like Delhi Haat, Shilparamam in Hyderabad, and the other craft markets, they almost became the hub where many people from the entire nation, they started coming, like many artisans. So that also gave a new dimension to the field of the contemporary folk art in India, or like whether we can call them folk art or not. So those questions come into being. So from the 1960s, we find that there were several such kind of like the so-called folk art practices which came into prominence, and then like people like Jagdish Swaminathan, whom we have discussed in the last week. So people like them, they have also put considerable effort to highlight some of the artisans like Jangar Singh Sham, who came from this from the Gond community. So things like that were happening. From the 1990s, we find that people people who came from this community backgrounds, like the artisanal communities, some of them were also received, some of them have also received training from the institutional art practice and from these art institutions, and that is how we find that how they have also contributed to the making of this new kind of folk art, which is suited for an urban audience, and some of the examples we can see here. So this is an image by Gopal Saha, and this is called the Selling Paintings to a European Tourist in 2004. And in this one, we find that this is acrylic color that is used on paper. So instead of using earth pigment or like the mineral colors, we find this readily available acrylic color is used here on paper to show something in the format of the traditional Madhubani paintings. And if we think about the theme is basically how it shows this one European tourist who arrives in this village perhaps, and then there is an artisan who shows the Madhubani painting. So this is a painting about the process of selling painting. So this is something that certainly we can see as a theme, how that actually is a departure from the earlier works, because the earlier works would perhaps indicate certain events from their socio-cultural background. Sometimes we definitely see that the changes in the society are also recorded, but a painting about the process of selling painting or about the process of making painting or artwork is something that is certainly unique, that we can find, and all those things happened after this new kind of dialogues came into being. Now this is another image that we find, and this is by the celebrated worldly painter Jivya Soma Mashe. And then Jivya Soma Mashe's works, we see that how they have also those works, they celebrate this stick like figures which are drawn with the rice paste on the mud walls of the worldly village. So here what we see that this is again, it's a acrylic on paper, and this is not about the traditional agricultural process or the village life, but this instead shows the process of coal mining. Coal mining is also something that in that part of Maharashtra is also a prominent occupational sector, and of course that there are many issues that we find there, that how the local people with the governmental bodies there are always. So as I have mentioned earlier, that how Jivya Somamashe, this celebrated painter in Worli, from Worli, then how he has also successfully incorporated some of these questions about material, technique, and some of the practices which were already been there in the Worli region of Maharashtra. So as you can see that, I mean, he has those celebrated the stick-like figures which are drawn with rice paste on the mud walls, and now we see that how those figures come to represent something that was certainly not there in the earlier paintings. So here we see the coal mining process instead of seeing how the agricultural process and the depiction of the socio-cultural life there, and the gods and the goddesses, how they are presented in these paintings. So it's a departure from there for sure, and at the same time we also see that, I mean, how there was a shift in terms of the profession, that the loss of agricultural land, and then how the coal mining had also became more and more prominent in these regions. So this artist like Jivya Somamashe, so they have made an effort to comment on this change in the socio-economic situations in the 1990s, in 2000s, and how their training in this particular processes like making of the Worli paintings, how that have enabled a new kind of expression which can certainly be distinguished from the contemporary urban artist in India. And here what we see that there is a deliberate use of acrylic color to replicate the effect of mud wall. So that is how, like, I mean, the gestural marks of the mud walls, those are deliberately made here, like as we can see all those gestural marks are also left in the background of this image. And then acrylic color is used for replacing the rice paste that is used with the stick to make those stick-like figures and this large narrative scenes. So this kind of activities we find that how this change in the socio-political situations, the economic situations, cultural situations, and more importantly the move of the rural artisans to the urban sectors, more and more interaction between the urban market system and the buyers with the rural sectors, that started making changes in terms of how we see the so-called folk art. And a lot of times, whereas like the artisans are identified within their community, people like Jivya Somamashe, Bhuribai, then of course Gopal Saha and many others, we find that how they have also charted their path as individual artists and not artisans. So this kind of discussions they were put forward by this larger socio-political changes that started happening from the 1990s. Now during this time we also find that there was a tremendous effort in terms of recontextualization of the traditional artistic practices, so or like the traditional artistic techniques. So in one hand we certainly see there was a drive towards moving beyond the traditional works like painting, sculpture, installation, graphics and so on, and moving towards the so-called new media. Then we also see that there were artists who have recontextualized the use of some of this traditional media of expression. So here we have Zarina Hashmi's work which are called the Letters from Home, and all these works are made from woodcut and letterpress print. So these are this entire series was actually developed in the 2000s, and what we find that Zarina Hashmi she had expressed her memories and experiences of reading and keeping the letters which were sent by her sister from the city of Aligarh in Uttar Pradesh. So we find that after the partition of India, then her family stayed back in Aligarh, but there was this, and part of her family moved to Pakistan, this newly constructed country, and then what we find that, I mean, after this time, that she was also in constant move between Thailand, in France, and then eventually she ended up in the USA, in the east coast of USA. So during all her this movement, she also missed out on a number of changes in her hometown in Aligarh. And so what happened, that when her sister wrote about those changes, like when their ancestral house was sold, when their mother died and everything, so those things she could not really be there in person. So that is the reason what we find, that those letters became historical document for her, and then she overlapped those letters with maps of places. It can be city maps, sometimes there are, like, I mean, plan of houses like this one, or like, I mean, a shape of a house like this, where the letter is securely kept within the house, the shape of the house. So this kind of imagery we find that, I mean, much more sort of immersive, meditative, and the images which were created by woodcut or letterpress. So the language of print was incorporated as part of making this kind of personal archive. So this is what we find in Zarina Hashmi's work, that how this medium of woodcut, letterpress, and sometimes intaglio and all, which she learned in Thailand as well as in France. So those were recontextualized in terms of how they were how they came to serve as fragments of memory and history from her home. So this is another work by Zarina, and what we see, this is called the Book of Travels. It was made in 2012, and it is an accordion book. So accordion book is also something that we find in the field of printmaking and paper making, and what we see, that there is this one line which sort of continues in the entire book, in this artist book, and there are no other text, nothing, and the line is sometimes broken, it is dismantled, and then, like, again it continues. So is a gesture, perhaps, like, I mean, how the barbed wire, we also find that sort of marks the boundary between lands, and also, like, I mean, through travels, how we transcend those boundaries. So for her, in the Book of Travels, in this artist book, this kind of ideas or this kind of concern about the line, its ruptures, its continuation, and their relationship to her life, those things came into you know, on surface. And the language of woodcut is also something, you know, that contributes to this bold lines, sometimes crude, sometimes disruptive. So how the technique is then you know, that helps the artist to come to this point of exploring these practices. So we'll continue more on this practice, and at the same time, like, I mean, some of the other issues in the contemporary art in India in the later lectures. Thank you.